What would you do if the person you loved publicly humiliated someone who was like family to you? Imagine your millionaire partner insulting the person who helped raise you, someone who was there for you through every milestone. How would you react? Would you stand by your partner, or would you defend the one who stood by you since childhood? This story takes a shocking twist when a millionaire's girlfriend crosses a line, leading to an unbelievable reaction from her partner. Stay tuned to find out how he handled this betrayal and what happened next. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel, and I will bring you the most jaw-dropping stories that reveal the true nature of wealth, relationships, and life's biggest lessons. Today, we're talking about a story that will make you rethink how some people treat those who've been there for them their entire lives. Let's get into it. It's always fascinating to hear the stories of those who have made it big, especially when they come from humble beginnings. David Morgan was one of those individuals whose rise to wealth was nothing short of extraordinary. Born into a family that struggled financially, he knew early on the value of hard work, determination, and perseverance. His parents worked long hours, often holding down multiple jobs just to put food on the table. But despite their struggles, they always stressed the importance of education and family values. However, it wasn't just his parents who shaped him into the man he would become. It was his childhood nanny, Helen Parker, who played a crucial role in his upbringing. From the moment he could walk and talk, Helen was there, guiding him, teaching him, and providing the love and care that a young boy so desperately needs. She wasn't just an employee to the family, she was family. In fact, she was the one who picked him up from school, helped him with his homework, and stayed up late when he was sick. There was no shortage of love and sacrifice that Helen gave to David throughout his childhood. As he grew older, David began to realize the importance of what Helen had done for him. She had been there through thick and thin, offering not only practical guidance, but also emotional support. As the years went by, she became more than just a caregiver. She became a mother figure, a mentor, and a constant source of wisdom in his life. He never forgot the sacrifices she made for him, and even as he became a successful businessman, he ensured that she was always well taken care of. He paid for her medical bills, provided her with financial security, and made sure she lived comfortably. But life, as it often does, began to change when David met Samantha Taylor. At first, their relationship seemed like any other. He was smitten, and she seemed to be equally taken with him. They went on lavish dates, attended social events, and shared their dreams and aspirations. He introduced her to his friends and family, including Helen. However, this introduction would mark the beginning of a dramatic turn in their relationship. For the most part, Samantha had always lived a life of luxury. She came from a wealthy family and had been accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Her world was one of designer clothes, expensive cars, and lavish vacations. While this life of privilege had its perks, it also meant that she didn't understand the value of hard work or the kind of relationships that people like David had built from scratch. She had grown up with everything handed to her, and her perspective on life was far removed from that of someone who had to fight for everything they had. The first meeting between Samantha and Helen was uneventful, but there was an underlying tension. Samantha, with her polished manners and expensive tastes, had no idea how to interact with someone like Helen, who had spent her entire life in service to others. She had little in common with her and didn't seem to care to make an effort. To her, Helen was just another old woman, hired help who had simply served her purpose in the past. It was clear that there was no real connection between the two women, and this began to stir something inside Helen. Despite the tension, David did his best to maintain peace between his two important women. He couldn't bear the thought of choosing between them, so he did what he thought was best. He tried to keep the interactions brief and polite. But it became apparent that the relationship between Samantha and Helen was deteriorating. Helen began to notice the subtle dismissals, the condescending comments, and the coldness in Samantha's demeanor. She felt uncomfortable in her presence and couldn't understand why David didn't see the issue. One day, things came to a head during a family gathering at David's mansion. The house was bustling with people, laughter and conversation, but an awkward tension hovered between the three women. David had been busy with business calls, and the atmosphere had begun to shift as the evening wore on. It was during dinner when Samantha made her ill-advised comment that would change everything. As the meal was being served, Helen offered to help clear the table, as she had done many times before. But before she could pick up a dish, Samantha scoffed, saying, "You don't need to do that. It's not your place anymore." The words were sharp, cold, and cutting. Everyone at the table went silent, unsure of how to react. David, who had always been protective of Helen, froze. The room was in stunned silence as Samantha looked around, clearly unaware of the gravity of her words. She was used to being the center of attention, used to people deferring to her, and had no idea how to deal with someone who wasn't intimidated by her wealth or status. But for Helen, those words were a slap in the face. She had been a constant presence in David's life, and she had sacrificed so much to help him become the man he was. For her to be dismissed so easily was something she couldn't tolerate. Helen stood up, her voice trembling but firm as she addressed Samantha. "I've been taking care of him since he was a child," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "I raised him, and I've done more for him than you'll ever know. Don't you dare disrespect me in my own home." The words stung, but Samantha didn't back down. Instead, she smirked, clearly unbothered by the confrontation. This moment of humiliation was the breaking point. David could no longer ignore the divide that had been growing between his girlfriend and his childhood nanny. The woman who had raised him, who had been his rock through everything, had just been humiliated by the woman he loved. It wasn't just a minor conflict. It was a betrayal of everything he stood for. He had always prided himself on being loyal to the people who had supported him throughout his life, but now he found himself at a crossroads. Would he stand by the woman who had been by his side since childhood, or would he choose the woman who, despite her beauty and wealth, had shown nothing but disdain for the people who had helped shape him? It wasn't just about a disagreement anymore. It was about respect. It was about loyalty. And it was about understanding the value of the relationships that truly mattered. The decision he made next would shock everyone, and it would forever change the dynamics of the relationships he held dear. The evening had begun like any other. The large dining room in David Morgan's mansion was filled with the sound of light conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional burst of laughter. Guests were seated at the long, polished oak table, with an elaborate spread of fine food prepared by the best chefs. There was an air of luxury that surrounded the entire event, an air that David had grown accustomed to. His success had granted him the kind of lifestyle most people could only dream of, and with it came the responsibility of hosting extravagant gatherings. This particular evening was no different. His close friends, business associates, and family members had gathered to celebrate his recent success. The mansion was adorned with delicate chandeliers and the finest art, and the atmosphere was one of warmth and indulgence. Everything seemed to be in perfect harmony, until that moment. The tensions that had been building up between Samantha Taylor and Helen Parker, David's childhood nanny, had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. It wasn't as if David hadn't noticed it. He had. The subtle jabs, the dismissive attitude, and the almost deliberate avoidance from Samantha when it came to Helen were becoming harder to ignore. Still, David didn't want to believe that the woman he loved, the woman he had envisioned a future with, could be so thoughtless. But it was hard to ignore the awkwardness when they were in the same room together. David had hoped that the family gathering would provide a moment of peace, a chance for everyone to put aside their differences and enjoy each other's company. But that hope would soon shatter, and the consequences would echo throughout his life in a way he never anticipated. The evening started off well enough. Laughter filled the room as guests complimented David on his success, and there was a general sense of warmth in the air. Helen, as always, played the role of gracious hostess, moving around the room with ease, ensuring everyone was comfortable and enjoying themselves. Despite the years that had passed, she still carried herself with the same poise and elegance that had earned her the admiration and respect of everyone who met her. Samantha, on the other hand, had become increasingly distant. She sat at the far end of the table, her posture stiff and her eyes cold as she observed the interactions around her. The way she glanced at Helen from across the room wasn't lost on David. He had hoped that this evening would be different, that Samantha would finally let go of her apparent disdain for the woman who had been so important in his life. But as the night wore on, it became clear that this was not going to be the case. Dinner was served, and the conversation flowed naturally, as it often did at these types of events. People discussed the latest trends, exchanged pleasantries, and caught up on business. David was sitting beside Samantha, his mind occasionally wandering to Helen, who was seated across the table. He admired how Helen seemed to have an innate understanding of people. She always knew just what to say, and when to say it, making everyone feel welcomed and valued. It was one of the reasons David had always looked up to her. But as the night wore on, the tension in the air became thicker. David felt it in his gut. Something was off. He had been so focused on making sure the evening went smoothly that he failed to notice the subtle exchanges between Samantha and Helen. It was clear that the two women were not only uncomfortable around each other, but also actively avoiding each other. Samantha, in her typical fashion, refused to acknowledge Helen's presence as more than just an inconvenience. And Helen, for her part, was becoming more and more disillusioned with the woman David had chosen to be with. It was when dessert was being served that the incident occurred. The grand finale of the evening had always been the rich chocolate cake David had insisted on ordering from his favorite patisserie. The cake was a masterpiece, decorated with intricate layers of frosting and topped with fresh berries. It was always the highlight of any gathering, and the guests eagerly awaited their first bite. Helen, as always, stood up to serve the dessert. She moved gracefully around the table, offering slices of cake to the guests. As she approached Samantha, she smiled politely, ready to offer her a piece of the dessert. But Samantha, who had been toying with her phone throughout the evening, barely glanced up. "No, thank you," Samantha said coldly, her voice dripping with a sense of superiority. "I don't eat food like this anymore. It's a bit too simple for my tastes." David's eyes widened in disbelief. He had heard Samantha say plenty of things that rubbed him the wrong way, but this was different. The words were not just dismissive, they were cruel. Everyone at the table fell silent, but before anyone could react, Samantha continued with a mocking laugh, clearly proud of herself for making a scene. Helen's face flushed. It wasn't the first time she'd been on the receiving end of Samantha's condescending remarks, but this one stung more than the others. Helen had always taken pride in her role in David's life. She had never asked for anything in return for the years she had spent raising him. But now, in front of the people she had helped raise David with, she was being publicly humiliated by the woman David loved. David, who had been quietly watching this interaction unfold, felt a surge of anger well up inside him. He opened his mouth, but for a brief moment, he hesitated. He looked at Helen, who had stiffened in her seat, and then back at Samantha, who was sitting smugly, seemingly unaware of the magnitude of what she had just done. The room was silent, all eyes on David as they waited for him to react. But the moment passed. No one spoke. The silence in the room was deafening. The tension was palpable. Everyone, including the guests, could feel the weight of what had just happened. But David remained frozen in place, unsure of what to say or do. It wasn't until David's father, who had been watching the exchange from across the table, broke the silence with a sharp comment. "David, your girlfriend just insulted your childhood nanny. Are you going to let that go?" David's heart skipped a beat. His father's words hit him like a ton of bricks. It was one thing for David to try to ignore the growing divide between Samantha and Helen, but it was another thing entirely to have his father, someone who had known both women, point out the obvious. Everyone at the table turned their gaze to David, waiting for him to respond. Samantha's smug expression faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "I didn't mean it that way," she muttered, though it was clear to everyone that her words lacked sincerity. Helen, however, didn't seem to be listening to Samantha's excuses. Her face had gone pale, and her eyes were filled with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. David could see the pain in her eyes, and it broke his heart to witness it. He had always known Helen to be strong, to endure the hardships of life with grace and dignity. But this was too much. Finally, David stood up. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness to it. "Samantha, you need to apologize," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You just publicly humiliated Helen in front of everyone. I don't care what you think of her or what you think of me, but you owe her an apology." Samantha's face flushed with anger. "I don't owe anyone an apology," she shot back, her tone biting. "You're overreacting." The room was stunned into silence again, the tension rising to unbearable levels. David could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. All eyes were on him now, waiting for him to make the choice that would define his relationship with both women. David took a deep breath, his voice steady and clear. "Then I guess this is where we part ways." The words felt like a punch in the stomach to everyone in the room, including Samantha, who looked like she had just been slapped. But David didn't waver. He had made his decision. As David walked over to Helen, he felt a sense of relief flood through him. He knew what he had to do. He reached out to her, offering his hand to help her to her feet. "Come on, Helen," he said softly. "Let's go." Without another word, David led Helen out of the room, leaving Samantha standing there in stunned silence, the room still vibrating with the aftermath of her cruel remark. As the heavy silence hung in the air, David stood there for what seemed like an eternity, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension in the room could be cut with a knife. Everyone was looking at him, waiting for a response, waiting to see how he would handle the explosive situation. It was the kind of moment that defined relationships, that determined where loyalties truly lay. David's eyes flickered briefly over to Helen, who was still sitting at the table, clearly shaken, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But his gaze quickly shifted back to Samantha. She sat there, looking stunned, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. Her eyes were wide, and her lips were pressed tightly together in a defiant expression. She clearly didn't understand the gravity of what she had just done, didn't realize how far she had crossed the line. To her, it was just another power play, another way to assert her dominance. But to David, it was an unforgivable betrayal. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, someone who valued loyalty and respect above all else. And for David, the people who had shaped him, the ones who had been there for him when he had nothing, deserved nothing less than that same respect. His father's words still echoed in his mind. "David, your girlfriend just insulted your childhood nanny. Are you going to let that go?" David clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. He took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "Samantha," he began, his tone steady, though there was a cold edge to it. "You just crossed a line, and I won't tolerate it." Samantha's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me about respect," she snapped, clearly not understanding the depth of his disappointment. "You're really going to let one little comment ruin everything?" David could feel his blood pressure rising, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to get into a petty argument with her. This wasn't about a little comment. This was about something much bigger, a matter of values, of the people who had helped him get where he was, and, most importantly, of who he was willing to allow into his life. "One little comment?" David repeated, his voice now rising with conviction. "You just humiliated a woman who has been nothing but loyal and loving to me. A woman who raised me when my parents couldn't. A woman who is the reason I'm the man I am today. And you think that's just a little comment?" Samantha opened her mouth to argue, but David raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him. everyone watching to see what he would do next. And he knew, in that moment, that this was more than just an argument. This was a test of character, a test of his own beliefs about what mattered. If you can't respect the people who helped shape me, who helped raise me into the person I am today, then I don't think you belong in my life. His words were clear, final. I'm not going to let someone who disrespects the people who have always had my back continue to be a part of my life. Not now. Not ever. Samantha's face twisted in disbelief. Her eyes darted from David to the other guests, who were all watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of shock and curiosity. She was clearly trying to process what was happening. This wasn't the reaction she expected. She had assumed that David would side with her, that he would sweep it under the rug, as he had done in the past with her other little jabs. But not this time. Not when it came to Helen. David's voice hardened as he continued. I don't need a woman in my life who can't show basic decency and respect to the people who have always been there for me. And I certainly don't need someone who thinks they can treat people like they're beneath them just because they have money. There was a long pause. Samantha's expression shifted from anger to a kind of stunned realization. She seemed to be grasping the weight of what David was saying, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done. She had crossed a line, and now David had to decide whether to let it slide or make a stand. And he was making his stand. I've tried to overlook your behavior for too long, Samantha, David continued, his voice now firm and resolute. I've tried to convince myself that you just don't understand, that you didn't mean to hurt anyone. But this? He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. This is something I won't forgive. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of Samantha's shallow breathing. The other guests had fallen into a state of stunned disbelief. No one could have predicted what was happening. David had always been the calm, collected businessman. Never the one to make rash decisions, never the one to create drama. But now, in this moment, he was showing everyone just how much he valued respect, loyalty, and the people who had been there for him when he had nothing. Samantha's face flushed a deep shade of red, her hands trembling as she sat frozen in her seat. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. The weight of the situation had finally hit her. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't just an argument that could be smoothed over with a quick apology. This was the end. David took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. I'm sorry, but this is over. It was like a punch to the gut. Samantha's eyes widened in shock, her lips parting as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. You're breaking up with me over this? She stammered. David didn't flinch. He stood tall, his decision unwavering. Yes, I am. Because I'm not going to choose someone who disrespects the people I love over the people who've loved me without question. I'm done. The finality of his words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before they landed like a heavy weight. There was no room for negotiation, no space for excuses. Samantha's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her eyes searched David's face for any sign of doubt, any glimmer of hesitation. But there was none. David turned his back on her, walking towards Helen, who had been watching the entire confrontation from the doorway. Her eyes were filled with a mix of shock and gratitude, but she said nothing as David approached her. Instead, he reached out, offering her his hand as a silent promise, one that spoke volumes more than words ever could. The room was still silent as David and Helen made their way to the door. The guests were left in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to what they had just witnessed. David's bold move had left them speechless, and it was clear that this would be a moment that would linger in everyone's minds for a long time. But for David, it was the only choice. He had made it clear that respect, loyalty, and love were more important than anything else. And for Samantha, the woman who could never understand the value of those things, there was no place in his life. As the door closed behind them, the last of the tension in the room seemed to dissipate. The gathering had ended, But for David, the real work had just begun. So by now, you've seen how things unfolded with David and Samantha. His decision to stand up for Helen, his childhood nanny, was a bold move, one that many would consider risky, especially given the way it all went down in front of his guests. But was it the right thing to do? Was David justified in taking such a drastic step in ending his relationship with Samantha, especially since they had been together for quite some time? Or do you think there might have been a better way to handle the situation? Let's break it down a bit. On one hand, David had a lot at stake. Samantha was, after all, the woman he was in a serious relationship with. He had envisioned a future with her, and it wasn't easy to make a decision like that. But on the other hand, Helen wasn't just any employee or acquaintance in David's life. She was more like a second mother to him, someone who had been there for him when no one else was. So, in a way, this wasn't just about one person being rude. It was about someone disrespecting a foundational figure in David's life. The fact that David didn't back down, even though it meant potentially losing someone he loved, speaks volumes about his character. Sometimes, standing up for the right thing isn't the easiest or most popular option. And while Samantha may not have understood the gravity of her actions,